Well, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time during these two important education events, Bett and Learnit, to reflect on how the education community and the tech sector can respond to this very urgent education crisis unfolding for Ukrainian children. This is one of the largest crises that children around the world are facing today. And of course, you in Europe are on the front lines of receiving those children. So it is very important that you're engaged in all of this. My name is Maysa Jalbout. I'm speaking with you today in my capacity as a non-resident fellow at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institute. I've been working on refugee education for more than 2 decades in many parts of the world as an advocate, a researcher, a policymaker, and a funder. It has always been a priority for me because I have witnessed firsthand through my own journey as a refugee and in working with refugee communities, the power of education in providing hope in the short term and in education being a bridge to building a better future over the longer term. Very sadly, almost 3.5 million people, half of them children, have fled Ukraine in the past weeks. The majority, 2 million refugees, are now hosted by Poland, while the remainder are in nearby European countries, including Romania, Moldova, Hungary, and Slovakia. And inside Ukraine, there are an additional 2 million people who are displaced and millions more who need assistance. Shifting a little bit to the global picture, worldwide, there are over 84 million forcibly displaced people. 40% of them are children, and very sadly, a growing number of unaccompanied children among them. Just to give you a bit of context as well, to date, the majority of refugees originate from just 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. The majority of those refugees are hosted in nearby countries, often developing countries. The largest refugee host country in the world today remains as Turkey, with 3.6 million refugees. And within Europe, prior to the current Ukraine crisis, Germany hosted the largest number of refugees at just over 1 million people. We know from years of delivering services to refugees around the world that families place education at the top of their priorities, immediately after security and basic needs. Refugee families understand intuitively what the research has shown us, which is that education is more than going to school and more than learning. It is about providing stability, addressing the psychosocial needs of their children, and ultimately weaving a safety net for their future. In very short, it is about hope. Unfortunately, education has often been forgotten when the international community mobilizes humanitarian support. Today, we have over 1.5 million Ukrainian children who are in need of education in host countries in Europe. And of course, we have the massive damage to education inside Ukraine, where we have more than 750 schools that have been destroyed, damaged, or forced to close, according to Save the Children. Yet the current humanitarian appeal for Ukraine asks that only 2.2% be devoted to education. That's, a very, very small percentage and amounts to a little over $10 for every child who needs education support. So education is absolutely critical, yet the response and the support to education remains much lower than where it needs to be. The international community is primarily focused on school children. I think that in this particular case, it's not going to be very different. The major emphasis is on making sure that children who are of school age, their education is not interrupted, that they're integrated into schools right away. And that is absolutely the right focus. But we must not forget about two other education cohorts that are very, very important and very feasible for us to support them. First, young children, those who are under 6. As you saw from the crisis unfolding, the vast majority of people who are leaving Ukraine are families with young children, single-headed families, primarily mothers who are on their own, who were separated from their spouses and have had to leave their extended family behind. Those mothers are going to need the support of communities, of early childhood centers, in caring for their children while they settle their lives. And of course, needless to say, education at that level is critical to the development of those children and to ensure, of course, that their psychosocial needs are met. So early childhood must not be forgotten. Secondly, oftentimes we forget the fact that many youth will have had their education disrupted, and therefore it means they may not be able to finish high school or go on to post-secondary education. I hope that just as we have seen in the early days, that universities, vocational centers will also open up to Ukrainian children and ensure that they are able to continue their education. And here, a message to the international community: universities around the world can also extend education online for Ukrainian children, Ukrainian youth, wherever they are. The international community has learned a great deal over the years in delivering education in the context of emergency and refugee settings. It is important, as this crisis unfolds today, that the European community and all organizations involved in delivering refugee education revert to the learning that we have, both in terms of research and delivery. And I could talk about 3 critical learnings that we must take into account. One is that we need to act very quickly. We know that education is so important in helping children overcome the trauma that they're facing by addressing their psychosocial needs and providing a safe and secure environment for them, and also in making sure that their education is not interrupted for too long. So it is imperative that we not take too long in creating the response, in ensuring that we open up schools for Ukrainian children immediately. Second, we need to make sure that funding is available. As I mentioned earlier, the humanitarian response for Ukraine is asking for too little money for education. And we have already, as an international community, made a commitment to prioritize education. At the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, the global community came together to create what is called Education Cannot Wait, a global fund for education in emergencies that to date has dispersed over $1 billion in education funding to the most disadvantaged children, refugees, and those who are living in conflict-affected areas around the world. At the time, it was accepted that a minimum of 4 to 6% of emergency and humanitarian funding should go to education. And the European Union at the time had suggested that they would set their benchmark at a much higher level, at 10 to 15%, depending on the situation. So it's important that we remember that we have this facility and that we've already agreed to fund education at a much higher level than is currently being requested. And third, we need to work with all parties to deliver education to Ukrainian children. We need to work through government, with schools and civil society to deliver a coordinated response that addresses the whole of the child needs for Ukrainian children. And that includes everything from language, psychosocial counseling, support for learning loss, and ensuring, very importantly, that the education that they receive is recognized locally and is going to be accredited so that they can carry that education with them as they move to a different country, perhaps, or go back to their own country in time. This is a critical lesson that we've learned in the past that we must ensure is at the center of our response today. So a coordinated response, one that's led by government and leads to accredited education. I think it's very natural that communities across Europe will want to respond to the refugee crisis, as we have seen. And all of this is incredibly important and a critical part of the humanitarian response to Ukrainian refugees. But it is just as important, also vital, for those who are coordinating the humanitarian response to ensure that we do not inadvertently do harm, particularly in education, as we roll out the response. So 3 things, I think. One is that we're very, very importantly, must avoid short-term solutions. I think while the response unfolds, we're responding very quickly and it is a crisis, but we must think about longer periods of time. We know from past crises that the average refugee is a refugee for 20 years. So this means that while we are oftentimes compelled to deliver short-term solutions, such as informal education in communities that may not be accredited by government, that may not have been approved by local authorities, that may not have trained teachers. This is something that could be harmful to children, particularly as it may not be recognized by government, they may not receive accreditation. And oftentimes, if those children are in informal education for a long period of time, that becomes the default long-term solution for them. So we must avoid these short-term solutions in as much as possible. Second, we must avoid uncoordinated approaches. And this touches on the first point, is that government at all levels have a very critical role to play, and they must work with civil society, but each have their roles. Canada is a very good example of how education is coordinated at all levels and is coordinated with other services that are delivered to refugee children, whether it is supporting them with their psychosocial needs or supporting their families at the community level. And it gives a fair amount of empowerment to local communities, structures and systems and incentives to support refugees. And third, we must avoid delivering solutions in silos. I think when it comes to refugee education, oftentimes it may be new to certain governments or communities or schools or philanthropists who want to support. And so they might start from scratch, or they might be very well-meaning. But it is really important in this context, and particularly as we have more and more entities that are visibly available to support, that we rely on research and evidence and global expertise and work in coordination with other parties and avoid these one-off initiatives in order to deliver more coordinated responses that are long-term and ones that are going to be most effective for Ukrainian children. Education technology has an important role to play in supporting refugee education, particularly in ensuring that the teachers who are delivering education to refugee children have the training and the resources and the support they need to make sure they are delivering on the needs of refugee children. Teachers are often bearing the brunt of delivering education to refugee children. They often don't have the resources they need. They may not necessarily be trained in delivering education to a child who has been through trauma or doesn't speak the language and may already be dealing with a large class size. So all of these issues make it a challenge for teachers, and technology can support teachers by delivering those support services by connecting them to teachers who have delivered refugee education, by making these tools and kits available to them, and creating a community of support for them. Oftentimes, teachers themselves say this is the most important thing, that they need a community of teachers that can support them. I think one thing that's really important about education responses is that, especially as Ukrainian children are dispersed across Europe, and they're integrated, hopefully, into national and local education systems, and are provided for in the way of language training and support, that we not forget about Ukrainian teachers. Ukrainian teachers are going to be an important lifeline for children and their families, not only because of language, but also because they can provide some familiarity, a connection to their community. And of course, they are also professionals in and of themselves who have valuable skills, and can contribute to supporting Ukrainian refugee children. So they must be supported, and they must be seen as a critical resource in the unfolding of the refugee education response. If there's one thing I wish people understood about refugees, it's that they are people like you and me who did not wish to be uprooted from their homes, to leave their families behind, or to put their children in these horribly difficult circumstances. Refugees are people who are temporarily displaced from their homes and are looking for safety, and are looking to rebuild their lives. And oftentimes, they contribute much more than the help that they have been given. I think we have an incredible opportunity to show cohesion in the response to the Ukrainian refugee crisis, and in delivering education to every Ukrainian child coming into Europe. There is really no excuse for us not to be able to deliver education quickly, immediately, and with all the resources that are available to us. And I think every stakeholder that is present at this conference, whether it's the education community, whether it's the edtech community, or philanthropists and thought leaders, we can all work together to deliver education for every child, and hopefully be able to extend that also to beyond Ukrainian children. As a reminder, there are still many refugee children in Europe, on the borders of Europe, who do not receive education and do not have the chance to go to local schools. I hope the response that comes out of Europe as a result of this crisis, and as a result of the thought leadership that's happening at this conference, extends to all children.